I'm now going to talk about a slightly unglamorous but really important aspect of pre-production, which is scheduling and planning. Essentially, I mean, all of pre-production is planning, but now we're planning how exactly production is going to work. And making a schedule and spending time working out the sort of technicalities is really important if you want production to go smoothly. So as part of this, you should be doing some planning to do with your schedule, and we call this either making a work plan, also called a production schedule. Work plan and production schedule are two effectively interchangeable terms for the document you would create at this stage, although a production schedule usually is used in the context of making some video-based media. So if you're working in film or TV, making an advert, maybe even an animation, you might refer to it as a production schedule, not just a generic work plan. And often you would, if you're making a production schedule, include more detail, because there's a lot more going on if you're doing filming usually. You know, the different actors, the different production crew, the scene locations, maybe what props are needed, etc, etc. Whereas a work plan is maybe a little bit simpler, but ultimately they are essentially the same thing. And both, whatever you're doing, is going to have to factor in both client and also end user requirements. So this plan is usually done right at the end of pre-production, because you would have had time to analyze the client and maybe even research certain end user requirements of your target audience. And the main goal of scheduling, right, is to consider time requirements, because ultimately you'll be given by the client some deadline, which is the time it needs to be finished by, and so you're going to have to factor in that requirement, effectively work backwards to figure out how much time you can allocate to each task. And your work plan or production schedule will also have to factor in what we call contingency time. So contingencies refer to, as the image here suggests, plan B. So what happens when your first plan goes wrong, when something is maybe delayed or something doesn't quite work out, you are going to refer to a contingency plan, which is a plan of what to do that may be a separate document. In terms of a work plan, you'll factor in, or should factor in, some contingency time, which is maybe a few days, a few hours, a few weeks, depending on the length of your project, which is left unallocated. So you're not planning anything specifically, you're just working with the assumption that things don't always go right, there may be some issues, and so having some time left aside means that if you have got issues, which delays things, you have kind of a padding zone where you can rectify the issues without going beyond your final deadline and not meeting that time requirement. To give you an example of how a work plan might look like, it's quite simple, because at their core, really, they are just a list of tasks, as in what you need to complete, with some time limits assigned. And the time limits will come from you working backwards from that final deadline. So I won't go through this whole table because it's just something I made up earlier, but in terms of the headings for components of this table, we'll have some listing of our tasks, which will come from you having done some designing first, and also you having done some discussion of end user requirements. So the task is usually like a big chunk, right? So in this case, creating navigation features, creating a homepage, and within a task there'll be various different activities, and usually the order of the activities does matter, which I'll talk about a bit more later regarding workflow. But you'll have usually several activities within a task, right? And then also, it's important at this stage to list out any resources you need. Now, a resource is just something you are going to need, and so it's quite generic, right? It could be software, it could be staff, it could be some hardware, it could be stuff like props if you're doing some filming, and it could be also other documents made in pre-production like mind maps and visualization diagrams if you're going to then use them later in production, which you should do, otherwise it defeats the point. And the duration column, if you are doing it in a table, will give you your overall timescale of your project. And in this case, at the bottom, I've factored in only 3 days of contingency. I don't know yet what activity that will be or what resources it will need, because ultimately the whole point of it is that it is sort of just free time in case there is an issue. And perhaps at this stage I should talk about why this is important. I mentioned that production maybe won't go smoothly if you haven't got a decent work plan. And this is because it's really hard, especially on a big, complicated, creative project, to meet a deadline unless you are planning out each part of it, right? And also, if you are, say, a project manager managing a fairly large team, you might want to allocate various different tasks to sub-teams. So you might give task 1 to one sub-team, task 2 to another sub-team, if they can work independently, and a task list or work plan enables you to do this. It also enables everyone to see exactly what needs to be done and by when. You might lose track of time in one of the tasks, and so having a clear duration will keep you on track. And also, at the end of a project or at various milestones, a project manager can look through the work plan and see if they are on track or are going too slow, and so can make any adjustments if needed. So a table like this might be limited in the sense that it's not particularly easy to interpret, and so you might want to convert a work plan into a more visual format to make it easier to interpret, easier to see what's going on. And also, it's important often to be able to visualize or plan out at least what activities can be done in parallel. So can certain activities be done at the same time? This is obviously assuming you've got more than one person doing it. So here, how many days have we got here unplanned? I've got 8 days planned. It doesn't tell me whether I can do some of those days at the same time, which obviously would reduce the overall timescale. Whereas a more visual diagram, maybe like a Gantt chart, is better at showing these parallel aspects. And even a flowchart, you could show some parallel aspects as well. It's a little bit harder of a flowchart, but it is more visual and easier to interpret. And there are loads and loads of project management tools for scheduling, which thankfully in this course we don't have to go into in detail because they're not very interesting to look at. But we do need to sort of talk about it in more general terms, because you'll often see in an exam question something like this. You may even have to sort of produce something like this, maybe from a scenario. And really this is just the same thing as before in a slightly more visual format, which this is maybe not a great example because this is more confusing than a table would be, but on a big project like this Gantt chart in the previous slide, it makes things a bit easier once you have all of your different tasks. So this is a Gantt chart effectively, but we're just going to refer to it as a general work plan. And this is now for some filming of an advert, right? So the first thing to point out is we have sort of on the right hand side some timescale. So in this case our unit is days. For other projects it might be months or even years. In some extreme cases, like a film might be over a year or two of production. And you have clearly the days right here. So we've also got tasks and activities. Remember, an activity is sort of part of a task, so you might have a few activities per task. Our first task is to actually do some filming, and we've got 2 activities. We've got a cafe scene and a car scene. And under our timescale, we've got different bars. So in green here is what I'm representing a day of work. And so the cafe scene is going to take 2 days. The car scene is going to take 4 days, according to this work plan. And in this sort of half shaded box is what I'm representing contingency. So time I've set aside in case the car scene gets delayed for some reason. Maybe it's raining and you need it to be sunny. You might add in 2 days just in case. And you can see in the car scene section, the first box is unshaded, which means no work is going on that activity in day 1. And so only after day 5, unless we have any issues, will the car scene be finished. The first day it's not being filmed, and so we have some overlap on day 2 between the cafe scene and the car scene. Maybe the actors who are going to be inside the car, they can do that filming on days 3, 4, 5 after they finish the cafe scene, but maybe day 2 is filming the exterior of a car, maybe where no actors need to be filmed, and so they can be left to film the cafe scene. That might be more efficient. So we have some parallel activity going on there. And the general order of how things work is what we refer to as the workflow. So the flow of tasks is the order in which the activities will be done within those tasks. So here the workflow is you can kind of do a little bit in parallel between the car scene and the cafe scene, but when we're doing graphics production, which is our second task, actually we can do this first of all in parallel with our filming, because there'll be some graphic design team working separately to the film crew. But here we've got a section between logo creation and 3D model creation where we have no overlap. So actually maybe here the workflow is you've got to finish the logo creation before you can start on the 3D model creation, perhaps because that model requires use of a logo. So workflow is the order in which things can be done, which needs to be planned in pre-production, otherwise it will be chaos during production. And finally down here, our third task here is what I say is a quality check. So maybe someone, the project manager, is signing off on the work done so far before more work is done maybe, or they move into post-production. But a milestone is a key event, which is sometimes marked on a Gantt chart like this with a diamond, or maybe a box shaded a different colour to your other boxes. Putting milestones in your plan, and usually it's more than one milestone, is valuable because it gives you an opportunity as a project manager to take stock, and usually they will be linked to some quality check or some review to see what progress has been made. Have you met roughly the plans? Maybe actually some of your timings are a bit unrealistic, but as long as you've got everything done which you were expecting to get done by a milestone, it means you are on track. If you're not on track, it provides you what is maybe an early opportunity to rectify it and make sure it doesn't get worse and you miss your final deadline. Maybe you hire someone else, maybe you try and modify a requirement, maybe you get rid of an activity if it's not totally needed. You take some action to prevent the project going off the rails. The only thing we've mentioned so far which isn't on a visual chart like this usually are resources. So there may be another column on the left hand side for resources, but usually for space reasons resources will be listed somewhere else in your work plan document.